That morning I stepped onto my porch, coffee in hand, only to discover something that made my heart nearly stop. There was an empty patch of ground where my prized tomatoes had been just the day before. I stood frozen, my eyes wide, unable to believe what I was seeing. That empty space looked at me like an open wound, and I felt as though I had just lost something incredibly precious, like a father mourning the loss of his beloved child. You might think I'm overreacting, but let me explain. These were no ordinary tomatoes. They were the fruits of an entire year's worth of careful tending. They were my pride, my joy, and frankly, the only escape from my daily grind. Indeed, my tomato garden wasn't just a hobby. It was my one and only escape from the madness of life. And now it was gone. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. But inside, a storm was brewing. My frustration was beginning to boil over. Who did this? The sky was clear, the neighborhood peaceful, the lawns trimmed to perfection, and the neighbors all smiling as usual. But now all of that seemed downright sinister. Someone had trespassed onto my property and stolen my tomatoes, and I was determined to find out who. I tried to push away the growing paranoia and reminded myself that this probably wasn't some high-stakes detective thriller. Surely it was just some random incident, or maybe a hungry squirrel. I found some comfort imagining a raccoon, indulging in an extravagant tomato feast at my expense. But that comfort was fleeting. I quickly realized someone from the neighborhood had sabotaged my garden, and I wasn't going to stand for it. I told myself to stop overthinking and walked back into the house, determined not to let this ruin my day. But the peace didn't last long. 2 days later, it happened again. This time, the thief didn't even leave a trace. They had taken the tomatoes clean, leaving only sad, leafy remnants behind. My frustration reached a boiling point. I couldn't just sit idly by anymore. I decided it was time to investigate. Equipped with my phone camera and a newly purchased wireless security system, I embarked on my new part-time role as a gardener and full-time detective. And it didn't take long for me to find my prime suspect. Karen, yes. That Karen, the notorious president of our Homeowners Association, HOA. She was infamous in the neighborhood for her relentless lawn inspections, passive-aggressive emails, and dedication to enforcing rules that nobody else seemed to understand. She'd always seemed overly interested in my garden, especially my tomatoes. On several occasions, she had openly critiqued them during her routine inspections, even going so far as to suggest I use more symmetrical tomato cages to maintain community standards. I knew she didn't like my casual approach to gardening, and honestly, I took a perverse pleasure in ignoring her unsolicited advice. But now I had a feeling she wasn't just criticizing my gardening style, she was actively sabotaging it. So I decided to keep an eye on her. If she was the one behind this, she was going to pay. That evening, while watering my plants and pretending everything was normal, I noticed Karen walking her miniature poodle. "Princess, past my property?" Her eyes narrowed as she looked at what was left of my once pristine tomatoes. When she saw me watching, she flashed an exaggerated smile, raised her hand dramatically, and chirped, "Oh, what a shame about your tomatoes. I guess gardening isn't for everyone." Her tone was dripping with condescension, and that was all the confirmation I needed. I smiled back politely and muttered something about pesky raccoons. But in my heart, I knew the truth. This was no raccoon. This was Karen. Once she passed, I quickly set up my surveillance camera, trying to be discreet like a spy conducting a secret operation. I adjusted the angle and checked my phone. Perfect. If Karen or anyone else came back to steal my tomatoes again, I would have irrefutable evidence. The next morning, I woke up early and anxiously checked the footage from the night before. At first, everything seemed normal. Birds chirping, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves. And then suddenly there she was. Karen, dressed in what could only be described as her stealth gardening outfit, oversized straw hat, gardening gloves, and pink Crocs. She approached my plants as if casually strolling down a grocery aisle. My jaw literally dropped as I watched her reach out, pick a perfectly ripe tomato, and casually tuck it into a small bag at her side. She glanced around nervously, as if she was committing an international crime worthy of the FBI's most wanted list. I sat there stunned, emotions swirling between rage, disbelief, and uncontrollable laughter. It was utterly ridiculous yet deeply personal. Karen, my HOA nemesis, wasn't just criticizing my gardening skills. She was literally stealing the fruits of my labor. The nerve, the audacity, the sheer chutzpah. Part of me wondered if she was planning a neighborhood salad party with stolen produce, maybe served with a generous helping of hypocrisy. But after the initial amusement wore off, determination quickly took its place. This wasn't just petty theft, it was personal. Karen had crossed the line, and it was time for payback. But not just any payback. No, my revenge had to be as memorable as it was satisfying. That's when inspiration struck like a lightning bolt. I pulled up a video titled Carolina Reaper Pepper Challenge, and a grin slowly spread across my face. Watching grown adults cry hysterically, their faces red and sweating uncontrollably, from the heat of the world's hottest peppers, I knew this was it. I would plant Carolina Reapers, the hottest peppers on earth disguised, cleverly among my tomatoes. Karen's next theft would be her last, at least her last comfortable one. My frustration morphed into excitement as I imagined her confidently biting into one of those peppers, expecting a juicy tomato, only to be greeted by fiery chaos. Oh, how poetic justice could be. Before long, I found myself excitedly shopping at the local gardening store, explaining to a bemused cashier that yes, I was indeed going to plant the world's hottest peppers, right alongside my tomatoes. The cashier raised an eyebrow, but I didn't care. Soon I would have the perfect bait. I spent the next few hours planting Carolina Reaper seedlings among my tomatoes, silently apologizing to the unsuspecting peppers for the dangerous mission ahead. As I stood back and admired my work, I felt a thrill of anticipation. Karen had no idea what was coming. 2 days later, the tomatoes were gone again. This time, the thief didn't even bother leaving behind the sad remnants of their crime. The garden, once full of vibrant red fruit, was now just a barren reminder of what I had lost. I stood there in disbelief, clenching my fists, my frustration reaching new heights. This wasn't just a random act of mischief anymore. It was personal. Someone was deliberately sabotaging my garden, and I was going to find out who, no matter what it took. I refused to be a victim in my own backyard. This wasn't just about tomatoes anymore. It was about respect, and I wasn't going to let anyone walk all over me. I decided it was time to take matters into my own hands. Armed with my new wireless security camera system and my phone, I was ready to start my investigation. I was no longer just a gardener. I was a detective, and this was going to be my case. I set up the cameras discreetly around my garden, careful not to draw any attention to my new surveillance operation. It felt like I was preparing for some covert mission, like an undercover spy trying to catch a criminal. My hands trembled with excitement and anticipation. Who was going to be stupid enough to come back and steal from me again? And when they did, I would have all the proof I needed to confront them. The days passed, and I anxiously checked the footage every morning. Each time, there was nothing, just birds chirping and the wind gently rustling the leaves. But I didn't give up. I knew the thief would strike again. It was only a matter of time. And then on the 4th night it happened. I woke up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, to the sound of my phone buzzing on the bedside table. I grabbed it frantically, nearly knocking it off the edge of the nightstand. The alert was from my security system. A movement had been detected in my garden. My pulse raced. This was it. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. I opened the app and stared at the live footage on my phone screen. My breath caught in my throat as I saw her, Karen. There she was, sneaking into my garden in the dead of night, wearing what could only be described as her stealth mode. Gardening outfit, oversized straw hat, gardening gloves, and those god-awful pink Crocs. She was moving so cautiously, as if she were a cat burglar on a high-stakes mission. I couldn't believe it. There was no doubt now. Karen was the thief. This wasn't just a random act of nature or a rogue animal. It was her all along, and she had been coming back night after night, stealing my tomatoes, probably to make some ridiculous salad for the next HOA meeting. The sheer audacity of it all left me speechless. I watched, completely mesmerized, as Karen slowly and deliberately reached out, picked a perfectly ripe tomato from one of my plants, and tucked it into her little bag. It was as if she thought no one would ever find out. But I had the footage. I had her red-handed. I wanted to confront her right then and there, to march outside and demand she explain herself. But I didn't. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of knowing she'd gotten under my skin. No, this required a different kind of retaliation, something far more satisfying. I needed to make her pay, and not just for the tomatoes, but for everything she had done to make my life miserable with her HOA nonsense. The next day, I made a decision. I was going to take things to the next level. I wasn't just going to stop at the satisfaction of catching her. In the act, I was going to make sure she would never steal from me again. And that's when the idea hit me. I remembered a challenge I had seen online, a video titled Carolina Reaper Pepper Challenge. The Carolina Reaper, one of the hottest peppers on earth. The thought of it made me smile, and an evil grin spread across my face. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I would plant Carolina Reapers among my tomatoes, the hottest peppers on earth, hidden in plain sight, just waiting for Karen to steal them. When she took a bite expecting the sweet taste of a tomato, she would instead be met with the fiery heat of one of the hottest peppers known to man. I couldn't help but laugh to myself as I imagined her reaction. The thought of Karen, the queen of passive-aggressive neighborhood control, succumbing to the inferno of a Carolina Reaper pepper, was nothing short of poetic justice. The next morning, I headed to the local garden store. The cashier eyed me suspiciously as I walked through the aisles, picking up seeds for the Carolina Reaper peppers. "You planning on starting a spice garden or something?" he asked, clearly not understanding my ulterior motive. I simply smiled, feeling like a mastermind plotting my revenge. "Something like that," I muttered, before quickly moving on to pick up the rest of what I needed. By the end of the day, I had everything I needed. I set up my garden, carefully planting the Carolina Reaper seedlings in between my tomatoes. Each pepper was tucked in with a sense of satisfaction. I couldn't wait for Karen to steal my tomatoes again, only to experience the explosive heat of the peppers. The next few days passed in a blur of anticipation. I checked the footage every night, hoping Karen would show up and make her fateful mistake. I couldn't help but chuckle every time. I thought about her unwittingly walking right into my trap. And then one evening, it finally happened. Karen appeared on the footage again, sneaking into my garden as if she were on a mission to steal my tomatoes once more. She was wearing her signature stealth outfit, straw hat, gardening gloves, and Crocs, and I could see the gleam of excitement in her eyes as she approached the plants. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. I held my breath as I watched her reach out and grab a tomato. But this time, she didn't even notice the subtle heat radiating from the peppers hiding nearby. She bit into it confidently, only to freeze in place as the fiery heat exploded in her mouth. It was glorious. Her face turned bright red as she gasped for air, eyes wide in shock. Her hands flailed about as she tried to find relief, but it was too late. The heat was overwhelming. She stumbled around, desperately trying to spit out the burning fire that was consuming her mouth. She reached for the garden hose, but in her panic, she sprayed water directly into her own face instead of her mouth. The sound of her screams echoed through the yard as I watched from my window, unable to contain my laughter. This was the payback I had been waiting for, the moment I had dreamed of. Karen had met her match, and it was both satisfying and hilarious. The sheer absurdity of it all left me in stitches, but I knew this wasn't over yet. She wouldn't take this humiliation lying down. No, Karen would find some way to retaliate, and I was ready for it. The battle between us had just begun, and I was determined to win, one spicy pepper at a time. I spent the next few days watching, waiting, as the days turned into an agonizing game of cat and mouse. The peppers had grown stronger, their fiery heat now something of legend, and I knew Karen wouldn't be able to resist coming back. She was bound to fall right into my trap. I had prepared for this moment with a calmness that only came after weeks of frustration and anticipation. Each time I checked the security footage, I imagined the glorious moment when Karen would take that first bite of the Carolina Reaper tomato and face the fiery consequences. But as I waited, something unexpected happened. My neighborhood, once so serene and orderly, began to change. The chaos I had unleashed was rippling through the streets. And it wasn't just me who was watching Karen anymore. I wasn't the only one who had grown tired of her reign of terror. It seemed my petty revenge had sparked a revolution, and the whole block was getting into the spirit of defiance. Neighbors who had never once shown an interest in gardening were now digging up their lawns and planting their own vegetable patches. Some even made their own attempts at growing tomatoes. It was as if Karen had unknowingly triggered a full-scale gardening rebellion. And I couldn't help but chuckle at the irony. The HOA president, the very person who had made her name enforcing rules no one understood, had inadvertently started a garden revolution. I wasn't just fighting for my tomatoes anymore. I was fighting for everyone who had been bullied by her petty rules. But still, I kept my focus on the mission at hand. No one could know about the secret weapon I had planted in my garden. My hybrid peppers, my fiery little monsters, had grown to a stunning red, their heat practically radiating from them. I could already imagine Karen's reaction when she took her first bite. Her face would turn crimson, her mouth would catch fire, and she would be helpless to stop it. One day, while I was tending to my garden, Mark Bennett, my usually quiet neighbor, walked over. "You're really going all out with those peppers, huh?" he said with a knowing grin. "You planning to start a new neighborhood spice market or something?" I could see the humor in his eyes, but I also saw the flicker of support. He was one of the few who had caught wind of what was going on. "I'm just experimenting," I replied with a shrug, trying not to give away too much. "Let's just say there's a spicy surprise coming for someone." Mark raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. I could tell he was in on the joke. What had started as my personal vendetta had somehow turned into something much bigger, a neighborhood-wide movement. Even Lisa Sullivan, the quiet HOA secretary, had started planting her own chili peppers. People were sharing gardening tips, talking about their crops and rallying together. It was no longer just about tomatoes or peppers. It was about standing up to Karen, and the whole neighborhood had gotten in on the act. I kept my plans quiet, focused on the day when Karen would be caught red-handed. That day came sooner than I expected. One afternoon, just as I was checking my garden for any signs of sabotage, I saw Karen strolling past my property again, this time with a determined look on her face. I knew that look. She was on the hunt for trouble, and this time it was my garden that would face her wrath. As she neared my tomatoes, I could feel the tension in the air. The moment had finally arrived. I quickly ducked behind my window, phone in hand, ready to watch the spectacle unfold. My heart was pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to expect. Would she hesitate? Would she realize that she was about to bite into something much worse than a tomato? Karen, however, seemed oblivious. She stepped into my garden with the same arrogance she always had, eyeing my tomatoes like they were prizes waiting to be taken. She reached for one, holding it up like a trophy. It was a perfect plump tomato. I could almost hear the dramatic music in my head as she took that first bite. The moment her teeth sank into the fruit, her face changed. Her eyes widened and she froze. I watched in awe as her confident expression quickly morphed into one of complete panic. She gasped for breath, her mouth opening and closing as if she were trying to say something, but no words came out. Her face turned beet red, and I could see the unmistakable signs of a person in intense pain. I couldn't help it. I burst out laughing. I watched as Karen stumbled around in the garden, her hands flailing wildly, trying to find relief. She grabbed the garden hose, but in her frantic state, she sprayed water all over herself, her face, her clothes, everything except her mouth. The scene was absolutely chaotic and hilarious. Karen, the queen of HOA rules, was now reduced to a gasping, flailing mess, spraying herself with water like she was in some kind of slapstick comedy. "Not so smug now, are you, Karen?" I muttered to myself, barely able to contain my laughter. The pain was clearly unbearable for her, and she staggered toward the street, her eyes watering, her mouth wide open, looking for anyone to help. But she was too far gone. In her pepper-induced panic, she collided with poor Frank Mitchell, the elderly neighbor who had just come outside to check on the commotion. Frank looked completely bewildered as Karen grabbed the newspaper out of his hands, waving it around like a fire extinguisher in an attempt to cool down her burning mouth. It was at that moment that I knew the tables had turned. Karen, who had spent years enforcing her absurd HOA rules, was now the one who had to face the consequences of her actions. The whole neighborhood was watching, and the sight of Karen, flailing and yelling about poisoned tomatoes, was more satisfying than I could have ever imagined. But the revenge didn't stop there. I knew that Karen wasn't going to let this humiliation slide. She would come back with a vengeance, and I had to be prepared. However, in that moment, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. My peppers had done their job. Karen had been taught a lesson she would never forget. As she disappeared from view, I took a deep breath, savoring the sweet taste of victory. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I had control over something in my life. And it felt damn good. The morning after Karen's pepper-induced meltdown, the neighborhood was buzzing with energy. Word had spread like wildfire. The incident had become the stuff of legend, with neighbors whispering and laughing behind closed doors. The image of Karen, once the proud HOA president, running blindly through the sprinklers, her face flushed and tears streaming down her cheeks, was now the highlight of every conversation. The whole block had witnessed her embarrassing moment, and it was a moment of poetic justice. But as satisfying as it was, I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to take defeat lying down. Her pride had been wounded, and she would fight back, using every weapon in her arsenal to retaliate. I could already hear the gears turning in her mind. I wasn't about to let my victory slip away just yet. No, Karen would have to pay the price for everything she had done to make my life miserable. The very next day, as I stepped out onto my porch to tend to my garden, I found an ominous envelope taped to my door. My stomach dropped as I reached for it, knowing exactly what it was before I even opened it. It was an official letter from the HOA addressed to me. I ripped open the envelope with a sense of dread, half expecting the worst. Inside was a formal notice, threatening legal action unless I immediately removed all dangerous plants from my garden. The letter accused me of violating neighborhood safety standards by growing potentially hazardous crops, namely my Carolina Reapers. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly at the irony. Karen had turned my harmless revenge into a legal nightmare. I quickly composed myself. This wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. I had to think fast. I needed to turn the tables on Karen once again, and I wasn't going to let her use the HOA rules against me. I knew the law better than she did, and I had one ace up my sleeve, the truth. I wasn't going to back down without a fight. I spent the rest of the day preparing my counterattack. I gathered all the footage from my security cameras. Everything from Karen sneaking into my garden to the moment she had bitten into one of my peppers and had that fiery meltdown. I meticulously documented each and every violation she had committed, including the countless times she had trespassed onto my property to steal my tomatoes. My plan was simple: expose her hypocrisy, show the world that she was the real criminal here. That evening, the HOA meeting was scheduled, and I knew it would be the perfect opportunity to finally put an end to this charade. The stakes were higher than ever. I wasn't just fighting for my garden anymore. I was fighting for my reputation, for the community's peace of mind, and for every neighbor who had ever been bullied by Karen's ridiculous rules. As I walked into the community center that night, I could feel the tension in the air. The usually calm and quiet room was filled with an electric energy. Neighbors whispered among themselves, clearly excited about the showdown that was about to unfold. Karen sat at the front, her usual air of superiority replaced with a look of barely contained anger. She had clearly prepared for this moment, but little did she know, I had my own surprises in store for her. The meeting began with the usual formalities. The HOA board members droned on about budget updates and community improvements, but it was clear that everyone's focus was on the upcoming confrontation. When it was finally Karen's turn to speak, she launched into a dramatic diatribe about the dangers of my garden. Her voice was dripping with sarcasm as she described my peppers as dangerous weapons, trying to paint me as some kind of mad scientist with a backyard full of toxic plants. I listened to her with growing frustration, but I kept my cool. I knew she was about to dig her own grave. When she finally finished her tirade, I stood up, my heart racing with anticipation. I had waited for this moment for so long. This was the final chapter in my battle with Karen, and I wasn't going to let her win. Karen, I said calmly, my voice cutting through the tension in the room. If you're so concerned about the safety of the neighborhood, then perhaps you'd like to test the peppers you're so terrified of. After all, you've been so vocal about their dangers. You should have no problem proving it to everyone. The room went silent. Everyone was watching, waiting for Karen's response. She hesitated, her eyes darting around the room, trying to assess the situation. She knew she was cornered, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. With a dramatic sigh, she reached forward, plucked a slice of the Carolina Reaper from the plate I had brought, and popped it into her mouth. The room collectively held its breath. For a moment, there was nothing. And then it hit her. Her face turned bright red, her eyes widened in shock, and she stumbled backward, gasping for air. The sound that escaped her was a mix of a gasp and a shriek, as she clawed at her throat, her hands flying to her mouth in a desperate attempt to stop the burn. She tried to speak, but no words came out, just a strangled wheeze as the fire from the pepper overtook her. I watched, hardly able to contain my laughter, as Karen flailed around trying to find relief. Her face was covered in sweat, and she was practically tearing her hair out in frustration. She grabbed for her water bottle, but in her panic, she managed to spill it all over herself. The chaos was both hilarious and poetic. "Guess that's not so harmless, huh?" I said under my breath, knowing the whole room could hear it. Karen, now a sweaty, gasping mess, stumbled toward the exit, her pride completely shattered. The audience erupted into applause, some clapping, others wiping away tears from laughing so hard. This was it, the final blow. I had taken down the HOA tyrant with a single pepper, and it felt glorious. As Karen bolted out the door, the HOA board members quickly gathered, clearly flustered. They knew they couldn't side with her anymore. With the footage I presented and the entire room's support, Karen had been exposed for what she truly was, a petty, vindictive bully. The meeting ended shortly after, with the board formally rescinding all complaints against me. Margaret, the quiet HOA secretary who had always kept to herself, gave me a sly wink as she gathered her things, clearly pleased with the outcome. That night, as I sat back on my porch, savoring the sweet taste of victory, I realized that this wasn't just about tomatoes, peppers, or revenge. It was about standing up to those who thought they could control everything, about taking back control of my life and my garden. The neighborhood had changed. Karen's grip on the community was gone, and now, it was a place where people could live without fear of unreasonable rules. And as I bit into one of my perfectly ripened tomatoes, I smiled, knowing that I had finally won. The HOA hearing was set, and the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone knew what this was about. It wasn't just about the garden anymore. It had turned into a full-blown battle of wills, and I wasn't about to let Karen win. The whole neighborhood had witnessed her embarrassing failure, but now it was time for her to face the consequences of her actions. And I was ready to make her pay, big time. I arrived at the community center early, my nerves on edge. The place was already buzzing with people, all whispering to one another. I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. Karen was sitting at the front, surrounded by her loyal HOA board members. She looked the same as always, tightly wound, her usual air of superiority radiating off her. But beneath that facade, I could see the cracks. She was nervous. She had to be. After all, everyone knew she'd been caught red-handed. But she wouldn't go down without a fight. The meeting started with the usual pleasantries, but it was clear that no one cared about the budget or community updates. Everyone's attention was on the upcoming confrontation. Karen cleared her throat, ready to launch into her speech, and I felt a twinge of excitement. This was it, the moment I had been waiting for. Her voice dripped with false concern as she described my peppers as a serious threat to public safety. She spoke with such gravitas, claiming that they were a fire hazard and a potential poisoning risk. Her words were so exaggerated, I almost felt like I was watching a bad courtroom drama. She paused for dramatic effect, ensuring that every single person in the room was hanging on her every word. I sat there listening to her ridiculous claims, fighting the urge to roll my eyes. She was completely ignoring the fact that it was she who had been stealing from my garden all along. It was the height of hypocrisy, and I was about to call her out on it in front of everyone. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up slowly, feeling the eyes of the room on me. The tension was palpable. I wasn't just fighting for my garden anymore. I was fighting for every neighbor who had been bullied by Karen's petty rules. I took a deep breath and spoke calmly, but with confidence. "Karen," I began, my voice steady, "you've spent years enforcing rules that no one understands. But you've crossed the line this time. You're accusing me of growing dangerous plants. Yet it's you who's been trespassing on my property and stealing my tomatoes." You've been the one breaking the rules, not me. The room fell silent. I could feel the shock rippling through the crowd. They weren't expecting this. Karen's face twisted in anger as she sputtered, trying to defend herself, but I wasn't done yet. I have the footage to prove it, I said, pulling out my phone and playing the video of Karen stealing my tomatoes. The room gasped as they watched her on the screen, her hands carefully plucking the fruit from my plants, her face full of smug satisfaction. The board members exchanged looks, clearly unsettled by the evidence. Karen's face went pale as she realized what was happening. She had no idea that I had been recording her every move. The once untouchable HOA queen was now exposed for the fraud she was. But I wasn't finished. I hit play again, this time showing the footage of Karen's meltdown after eating the Carolina Reaper pepper. Her frantic, gasping struggle for air played out in front of everyone. The room erupted into laughter, and Karen's face turned beet red. She was absolutely humiliated. You see, I continued, a smile tugging at the corner of my lips. I planted those peppers as a warning, a reminder that no one, not even you, gets to mess with my garden or my life. And yet here you are trying to turn the tables on me, accusing me of something I didn't do. It's time for you to face the consequences. Karen stood up, her hands trembling with fury. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She was losing control, and everyone could see it. I could feel the power shifting in the room. The once mighty Karen, who had held so much sway over the neighborhood, was now reduced to a sputtering mess. This is outrageous, she cried, but no one was listening. The board members were too, busy reviewing the footage and whispering amongst themselves. It was clear they were beginning to see Karen for what she really was, a petty, vindictive bully who had used her position of power to get whatever she wanted, regardless of the cost to the rest of the community. Finally, Margaret, the usually quiet HOA secretary, stood up. She hadn't said a word throughout the meeting, but now she spoke, her voice calm but firm. Karen, she said, addressing her directly, I've seen you steal those tomatoes myself. I've been quiet for far too long, but I won't stay silent anymore. You've been manipulating everyone in this neighborhood for years, and it's time for you to answer for your actions. The room went silent again. Karen looked like she'd been slapped. Margaret's words hit harder than anything I could have said. It was the moment that turned the tide completely. Karen stammered, trying to defend herself, but her words were lost in the noise of murmurs and whispers from the crowd. The board members were no longer on her side. They could see the truth, and it was like a dam had broken. The evidence was undeniable, and the truth had finally come to light. In the end, the HOA board rescinded all of Karen's complaints against me. They acknowledged that the charges against me were unfounded, and Karen's reign of terror was over. The room erupted into applause, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction wash over me. I had won. As the meeting ended and people began to file out, I caught Margaret's eye. She gave me a sly wink, a silent acknowledgement that I had done what needed to be done. And as for Karen, well, she stormed out, her face a mixture of humiliation and rage. But I wasn't worried about her anymore. I had finally taken back control of my life, and the neighborhood was no longer under her thumb. And as I walked back to my garden, my heart swelling with triumph, I knew I had won, not just for myself, but for everyone who had ever been bullied by someone like Karen. The battle was over, and the victory, sweet. The dust had settled, and for the first time in what felt like ages, peace returned to the neighborhood. It was a strange peace, one born out of rebellion and triumph, but it was peace nonetheless. The victory had tasted sweet, and now as I stood in my garden, finally able to enjoy the fruits of my labor without fear of them disappearing, I couldn't help but savor the moment. Karen, the once mighty president of the HOA, had been completely exposed for what she truly was, a petty tyrant who used her position of power to control and manipulate the lives of everyone around her. Her embarrassing meltdown, the footage of which was now a viral sensation, had cemented her as the laughingstock of the neighborhood. Her plans to control everything were in ruins, and she was left scrambling to pick up the pieces of her shattered ego. The aftermath of her humiliation spread through the block like wildfire. The once rigid, rule-abiding community had changed overnight. People who had once quietly obeyed Karen's ridiculous demands were now standing up for themselves. What started as my small act of revenge had sparked a wave of defiance. Gardens that were once neat and perfectly manicured now had colorful patches of vegetables and flowers, each one a silent rebellion against Karen's overbearing rules. I couldn't help but smile as I watched my neighbors working in their yards, chatting and laughing. The neighborhood had come alive in a way it never had before. Even Jerry, who had never so much as watered his lawn, was now proudly growing a garden of his own. As he waved at me over the fence, I waved back, feeling a sense of camaraderie I hadn't felt before. But the real icing on the cake was when I saw Mark Bennett, the usually quiet neighbor who had never taken sides before, walk over to me with a grin on his face. "Hey, Ethan," he said. "I just wanted to thank you for standing up to Karen. She's been a pain for years, and now it feels like we can finally breathe easy. You've really shaken things up around here." His words hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't realized just how much of an impact this whole situation had had on the neighborhood. It wasn't just about tomatoes or peppers anymore. It was about reclaiming our freedom from someone who had tried to impose their will on everyone else. I nodded, grateful for the support, but also aware of the power that had been unleashed. "It wasn't just me," I replied. "It was all of us. Karen might have thought she could control us, but look at what's happened now. We're a community again." Mark smiled and clapped me on the back before walking back to his yard. I stood there, feeling a sense of satisfaction wash over me. This was more than just a personal victory. It was a triumph for the entire neighborhood. As for Karen, well, she had all but disappeared from the scene. After the HOA meeting where she had been publicly humiliated, she seemed to shrink into the background. No longer did she patrol the neighborhood with the same air of authority. Her emails had stopped coming, and her visits to check on everyone's lawns had become a distant memory. It was as if the very foundation of her power had crumbled, and with it her hold on the neighborhood. The last I heard, Karen had tried to file a lawsuit, claiming that I had defamed her character and caused irreparable damage to her reputation. But even the lawyer she hired seemed to lose interest once they saw the mountain of evidence against her. The video footage, the witness statements, and the undeniable truth of her actions had made any legal battle practically impossible. Eventually, she dropped the case, her pride shattered beyond repair. Now, as I looked out at my garden, finally free from her prying eyes, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of relief and joy. The tomatoes I had worked so hard for were safe. The peppers, well, they'd had their day in the sun, but now it was time for them to rest. And yet, despite the satisfaction of seeing Karen put in her place, there was still a lingering thought in the back of my mind. Karen had been the catalyst for this whole transformation, but she was still out there, lurking somewhere, nursing her wounds. There was no doubt in my mind that she would try something again, perhaps in some other town or neighborhood. But for now, I was going to enjoy this moment of peace, this sweet victory over the person who had tried to ruin my life. As the days went by, things returned to normal, or at least a new version of normal. People were more relaxed now, more willing to speak up and stand their ground. It was a refreshing change, one that I had never imagined could happen when I first started this whole ordeal. The quiet rebellion I had initiated had turned into something much larger, something that would continue long after Karen's exit from the HOA scene. And as for me, well, I had learned something important through all of this. It wasn't just about revenge or getting back at someone who had wronged me. It was about standing up for what was right, about not letting others dictate how you live your life. I had found my voice, and in doing so, I had given my neighbors the courage to find theirs. So as I sat back on my porch that evening, enjoying a well-deserved glass of lemonade, I couldn't help but think about how far we had come. The neighborhood was different now, and so was I. We were stronger, united by the small act of defiance that had started with a stolen tomato and ended with the fall of a self-proclaimed queen. Life, I thought, was finally good again.